shall overcome.
Hi, my name is Jason Shaiman, Curator of Exhibitions at the Richard and Carol Cox Art Museum at Miami University, and we're located in Oxford, Ohio, which is incredibly important for the exhibition that we're going to go through, titled Through Their Lens, Photographing Freedom Summer. This exhibition is about the photographers who documented the historic Freedom Summer of 1964. And Freedom Summer was all about helping disenfranchised Black voters in the South, particularly in Mississippi, to be able to register to vote. This was a major point in the civil rights movement that was recognized that Black voters did not have that voice. So Freedom Summer was created to assist them. There were about 800 volunteers that came to the Western College for Women, separate from Miami University, in June of '64. And it took place over 2 weeks in June, 2 one-week sessions. And some of the photographers were here during the first week, some during the second week. We also have a photographer who was not even located here in Oxford, but was documenting in Mississippi. So we'll go ahead and take you through in a moment, but I also want to kind of give an understanding of why we did this exhibition. So this year marked the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer. So this was a real pivotal time, and especially when we think about many of the photographers, as well as the volunteers, are sadly no longer with us, and we felt that we really needed to help record their stories. The other reason we did this exhibition was to connect with FOTOFOCUS, which is a Southwest Ohio-based photography initiative that encourages museums, galleries, universities to do photographic exhibitions. The theme of FOTOFOCUS for October of this year was backstories, and it really fit perfectly for what we wanted to do in telling the backstories of the photographers. There were about 12 photographers who documented Freedom Summer. We have 7 illustrated in the exhibition, including Bob Fletcher, George Richmond Hoxie, Danny Lyon, Ted Pallenbaum, Herbert Randall, Steve Shapiro, and Tomio Wakayama. So as we go through, I'll be mentioning some of these names, but taking a look at some of these. We organized the exhibition in chronology because it helps tell their story in conjunction with the Freedom Summer story. So as I mentioned, there were about 800 volunteers who came in June of '64. And there were a lot of facilitators of the training including Bob Moses, Dave Dennis, a lot of people from around the country that were part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, along with core members, the Congress on Racial Equality. And they brought in some of these photographers that they brought in, but there were also some of the photographers who came from like Life magazine or Time magazine, for example. The first that were presented here is Herbert Randall. Herbert was a New York photographer, African American, as well as Native American, Shinnecock tribal affiliation. And Herbert was here during the second week. But one of the wonderful photos that he captured was of the entrance to Western College. And for the volunteers, this was the starting point. But it was also a starting point for Herbert, as this was the entry into Western College for Women campus. And during a lot of his time here, as well as the other photographers, they were photographing a wide variety of programming and training. Some of them were more based on lectures and what they had to learn about Black history in America. They had to learn about the Constitution. They had to learn about Southern history, civil rights. And so they were documenting a lot of the activities. These might seem visually mundane type images, but these were incredibly important when you look in the audience and you see the engagement. This photo was actually taken in Leonard Theater, which is in Peabody Hall. And it was probably the premier training facility for these large gatherings of these photos. Now, Herbert's perspective as coming in and photographing, again, was really unique along with a lot of the other photographers, because for many of them, this was an important step of their own journey of working in the civil rights movement. Some of the other photographers included George Richmond Hoxsey, who was actually living here in Oxford. And Hoxsey was an internationally known photographer, did a lot of mostly portrait photography and studio photography. But a story that we understand is that George was well connected in the Oxford community and was friends with the editor of the Oxford newspaper. So when story came out about Freedom Summer Training, it's likely that Hoxsey found out from the editor, and Hoxsey just came onto campus to document. We don't have a lot of photos by him, but a really important one and a major aspect of the uniting of the volunteers was music. And central to a lot of this was Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a major activist in Mississippi, a big part of Freedom Summer, and music was incredibly inspirational to her in rallying, bringing people together. And it was important for us to look at, here's Hoxsey, who was a local photographer, not associated with the civil rights movement, didn't really have any engagement beyond this, but as a local photographer, seeing the importance of coming in and documenting something that is really going to have a lasting impact on American identity and politics and history and voting rights. So it was really important that we did include some of Hoxsey's photos. This photo here, we believe, was actually located out in front of Clawson Hall on the Western College for Women campus, which was also a very important building for other activities, part of Freedom Summer. Now, part of the training that really went into, aside from a lot of the learning about the history and the importance, there was also, students had to be prepared to what they were going to experience in Mississippi. And Ted Pollenbaum took this photo of a mock nonviolent training activity. And this was also right out in front of Clawson Hall. And what was really wonderful is a unique perspective that Ted took. There are other photographers, some of which are featured in this photo, including Steve Shapiro, who's also in the exhibition. But some of the photographers, like Steve, were photographing right in all the activity. Ted went upstairs onto likely the second floor and looking out a window was really able to capture this amazing view of the activity of this mob, of this scene. Now, what we end up seeing are students that are dropping. One of the things that the nonviolent training was preparing was that when whites and blacks going into Mississippi, there was a likelihood of violence, and they had to protect themselves. They had to learn about dropping, protecting the head, protecting their kidneys, protecting each other. And so this is this activity where they were, enacting starting this kind of pushing and shoving and verbal abuse, and then how it becomes physical and what to do in preparation. This was really an important sense of reality for what they were going to face. So this is a really wonderful photo that we have demonstrated And there are a lot of others that have been photographed of this. Now, another important photograph that Ted Pallenbaum had also taken, which has really become a very iconic photo about Freedom Summer, is the volunteers singing "We Shall Overcome." And as I mentioned, music was incredibly important in the civil rights music. Spirituals became a wonderful rallying cry and voicing the emotions and the calling of people together. This was on Saturday, on June 20th, which was the last day of the first week of training. And as volunteers were preparing to board the buses to take them to Mississippi, Ted was here photographing this important event. And one of the things that's really important as well about just documenting this was that Ted recognized that something really happened with Freedom Summer training. There was a lot of tension between whites and black volunteers. Many of the black volunteers were very concerned that whites didn't really know what they were getting themselves into in the civil rights movement, and particularly in such a volatile place as Mississippi. And there was an incredible effort to bridge a lot of these divides of class, of gender, of race. And this photo really captures beautifully the coming together. And singing "We Shall Overcome" is always a really important moment in civil rights activities and grouping, because volunteers will cross their arms and hold each other's hands. And they link themselves physically as well as linking through song. And as Ted was photographing this and recognizing this importance of documenting this important moment, what was unknown at the time that this had taken place was earlier that morning, there were a volunteer and 2 trainers who also went to Mississippi. And they left earlier that morning, and they include James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. Now, there is the unfortunate ugly side of Freedom Summer that became a reality that's separate from those going on the buses, is that that morning of Saturday, June 20th, Michael Schwerner, and this was his car, drove Andrew and James down the Mississippi to investigate a church burning. It was a ruse by the Ku Klux Klan because they wanted to murder Michael Schwerner. And James Chaney and Andrew Goodman, unfortunately, the wrong place at the wrong time. So with the Ku Klux Klan and their plans for Michael Schwerner, when they arrived down in Mississippi, they were ambushed, and they went what was believed to have been missing by the organizers of Freedom Summer. What ended up happening was that they were murdered. Michael Schwerner's car was burned and dumped in a nearby swamp in Mississippi. And Steve Shapiro, who was photographing for Life magazine, was down. He was actually here for the first week of training and had gone down to Mississippi. He found out through the media and through news that the car had been found and that the body, the 3 men were missing. Steve went to the site and was photographing and documenting this. And something that developed, which really kind of places the reality for the photographers of what they were facing, not just the volunteers, was Steve recounted a story when he was here that he was photographing what he called a big burly sheriff, not this one featured in the photo. And as he was photographing, the sheriff approached him, grabbed Steve's camera, opened the back, ripped out the film, threw it on the ground, and gave him his camera back. And obviously, Steve had to be very careful of what he was doing and how he was reacting. What Steve didn't know at that time, that big burly sheriff, was one of the ringleaders of the murders of the 3 men. And when that came out, imagine the emotions of realizing how close Steve came in many ways to, who knows, what would have actually happened to him. But it really helped place the reality and the gravity of what they were dealing with as far as the intense racism in Mississippi. Now, another photographer that was really important for documenting the early part of SNCC was actually Danny Lyon of these 2 photos, was the very first photographer for SNCC. He was not here in Oxford, but he photographed mostly in Mississippi. But he had been in Virginia with Bruce Gordon. And as they were driving down to Mississippi in Bruce's car, there was a problem. Danny recounted of the windshield wipers not working, and they had to pull off into an auto repair facility. And you could see the tires in the back. And Bruce was on the hood of the car. And obviously he looks like he was joking around, having a lot of fun. But he mentioned to Danny to get something out of the glove box. And as Danny opened up the glove box, he found a rag and something heavy within the rag. And Danny realized as he opened it up what it was. And it was a handgun. And he kind of came to this understanding that, for one, Bruce had to protect himself. And I think it really placed a little more of that reality for the photographers of, as a white photographer, as Danny was, what the circumstances were for the other people involved in Freedom Summer. And, you know, he took this photo of just documenting this, and it seems like an innocent, fun photo. But when you understand the stories that are behind taking these photos, it really sheds a lot of important light on what was happening. Now, one of the other photographers, Tomio Wakayama, who was a Canadian, Japanese-Canadian photographer, and actually, Tomio was not originally a photographer when he engaged with Freedom Summer. He was working mostly with their marketing materials. And Danny Lyon approached him and said, you know, you have a really unique eye for this. And he gave Tomio a camera and said, you should try taking some pictures. And Tomio really became an important contributor to the photography. And Tomio was located, as like the other photographers, in different areas of Mississippi. He was placed in the Delta. And while he was there, this was such an absolutely amazing photo. He was inside of a community center photographing out. He took a few photos of this particular gentleman looking in. And there was information in the window about SNCC and Freedom Summer and the activities. And Tomio had a really unique lens because his family went through, and even he as a child, through the Japanese internment camps in World War II. So he had a different understanding of what racism and what this kind of segregation really meant. And he felt that connection with the experiences of Black Southerners. So he brought a really important voice to this. Now, we often think about things that are happening in the civil rights movement, about issues of the lunch counter sit-ins. And this is another Ted Pallenbaum photograph in Mississippi. And it always struck me really important why he photographed this, because we often think about the sit-ins that were happening in North Carolina and South Carolina, Virginia, but in the Deep South. And understanding, imagine, as a white person, Ted Pallenbaum could have easily gone up and sat down and ordered whatever he would want, no questions asked. Why someone else of a different skin color could not? And him photographing this sit-in where these women here are unable to receive any kind of service. And I think it's really important that he was documenting the importance of this relationship and connection with the staff in this restaurant. And again, these are some of these important stories that come out that we often don't necessarily think about the separation between people, but again, as a photographer, that he had to look at these. Now, another photo that we have by Danny Lyon, which is really important, and this is an absolutely beautiful photo with Bob Moses. Bob Moses, Dave Dennis were the two people really responsible for developing Freedom Summer. And this photo that Danny Lyon had taken was showing the engagement of what the volunteers were really doing in Mississippi. They were engaging in voter registration canvassing, but they were also approaching and checking on the welfare and the well-being of a lot of the Black residents that are being disenfranchised. And again, as a white person, Danny, was looking at this very much from an outsider. But what's really unique is that he placed himself behind this woman so that he was really kind of becoming part of the experience of how the Freedom Summer volunteers were engaging. Now, a couple of other photos that I think are really important to document, and I found this one to be incredibly poignant, is another photo by Herbert Randall. And Herbert, being a Black photographer, could easily relate to the information that is being shown of his own race as a Black gentleman, Ebony magazine, but also history of Africa. And that he would have had the luxury of learning about all of these in his formal education in the North. And that he was seeing that for many of the Black residents in Mississippi, they were first now being introduced to a lot of their own history. And the way he looks over the shoulder of an adult in an adult literacy class and the connections that they're making and understanding their own identity must have been really interesting for Herbert to think about how he already had that information, but also thinking about his place in Freedom Summer, maybe not just as a photographer, but as a Black gentleman. Now, one of the other really important photographs that really want to kind of cap off this is Bob Fletcher. And Bob was also a Black photographer. And this was after all of the activities of Freedom Summer. And it was really about voting rights. And what ended up developing throughout Freedom Summer, and Fannie Lou Hamer was incredibly engaged, is the development of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP. And the intention was to create a party in Mississippi where everyone, Blacks, whites, could all be part of the Democratic Party rather than the established Democratic Party of just whites in Mississippi. And in Atlantic City in August of 1964 was the Democratic National Convention. And this is where they were trying to get the MFDP to be seated on the floor at the convention. It ended up not really working out. Unfortunately, the political system at the time really prevented this from happening. But what's beautiful about this photo with the fireworks and really celebrating the importance of the achievement of Freedom Summer and getting there, and that there were these signs with James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, in recognizing their sacrifices that had enabled Freedom Summer to progress to this point. Now, although the MFDP was not successful, all of the activities of Freedom Summer that these photographers were documenting and shedding light, these photographs were shown in newspapers, in magazines, and they really opened up eyes on the national level of what was really happening with race issues in this country. And all of these activities eventually led to the Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965.